So it's my pleasure to welcome the two guest speakers for today, which includes my good friend Jayesh Parekh, who is a serial entrepreneur and has been in Singapore for a long time as a base, and is also very engaged with Singapore, with INSEAD students as a mentor and entrepreneur in residence. He can tell you more about that. And then through him, I recently came to know Gautam Godhwani, who's moved from the Silicon Valley to Singapore recently. And the two of them have set up a new fund, which I saw has been getting a lot of coverage in the past few weeks. So congratulations, Gautam and Jayesh. The fund is about the alternative protein movement. So more broadly, it's not just about plant-based meat, which is what our case will be about. But it's good to get a big picture of the sector and the investors' perspective from them. So they'll be here with us for the first 40 minutes or so. The idea is they'll present for 15, 20 minutes what they're doing, and then they're happy to have a broader discussion related to the sector and so on. So with that, I think I should pass it over to Gautam. Gautam and Jayesh, thanks a lot for making time, and welcome again to INSEAD.
Thank you so much. So I think what we'll do is just quickly go through a bit of an introduction. So I live in Singapore, and I've been in EIR at INSEAD, both EIR and SEIR. So I spend half a day doing just the EIR, and SEIR is half a day, but usually the SEIR, the social entrepreneur in residence, spills over. There's a lot more demand for that at INSEAD, especially in the Singapore campus. And so I've been associated also in a few other classes, specifically with Professor Jasjit and Professor Bala and Professor Phil Anderson. My background is that I studied at University of Texas at Austin, went to work for IBM. And then after IBM, I did a startup called Sony Entertainment Television, which is a television channel network. And after that, I helped start a technology venture capital fund called Jungle Ventures here in Singapore, which invest in Southeast Asia and in tech space. And then recently, in the last 8 months, Gautam and I reconnected, and he moved to Singapore, and we've started the venture capital fund, which is called Good Protein Fund. And we'll tell you a little bit about that. And it's such a pleasure to be here today. Gautam?
Yes, first, Professor Singh, thanks for having us. And a good morning to all of you. I understand you're sharing the early part of your morning with us, so we are especially appreciative. Let me share my background. I have spent my life in Silicon Valley. Education is Berkeley Computer Science, and my career has been a couple of startups. The first was a web tools company called AtWeb in the early days of the internet that was acquired by Netscape and AOL. Then a recruitment platform called Simply Hired, which was acquired by Recruit Holdings in 2016, which is the largest recruitment entity in Japan. I, since then, have been investing in startups, and I moved to Singapore 4 months ago. And Jayesh and I have been now working on this. Jayesh, we can say the better part of a year. It's getting to be that time. So as Professor Singh said, what we'll do is we'll spend 15 to 20 minutes telling you about our fund and about the thesis, and would really love to hear your questions at the end of that and have a discussion. So with that, let me share my screen, and we will get started. So hopefully everybody can see that okay. As Professor Singh mentioned, Jayesh and I are partners in a venture capital firm called Good Startup. Our mission is to remove animals from the food system. We are an impact fund, though economics first. The fund itself is called Good Protein Fund 1, and it is a global venture capital fund that invests specifically in alternative protein companies. In all, it is a $25 million fund and will invest in 32 companies with average check sizes of 250 to 500K. We have made 8 investments so far. Give you a sense of the kinds of investments we've made. We've invested in Eat Just, which is the world leader in global egg substitutes. Turtle Tree Labs, which is a local Singaporean company that takes stem cells and signals them to become mammary cells and has them secrete infant milk. And also in Rebellious Foods, which makes plant-based chicken, but is also innovating on the equipment to make plant-based meat more efficiently. So it gives you a sense of the kind of companies that we are investing in. So we believe that we are right at the beginning of a massive shift that is going on in our food system. And that is precipitated by three major trends. The first is that people want to be more healthy, and they're saying, I want to eat more plants. And what that is bringing on is a global flexitarian movement. And that is what these folks are calling themselves. Globally, that number today is about 20%. In the US, that number is 47%. And when you look at the next generation, that number is over 50%. So we believe the writing is very much on the wall that this shift is happening. We are also seeing a significant technological shift in the way that food is made. Now, we've been engineering food for a very long time. We have just been doing it using biotech, food science and ingredients. Now, rather, we are using biotechnology and molecules. And in our view, this is as fundamental a shift as the transistor was in the 1950s, which essentially ushered on the information age. And finally, you know that we are heading toward a population of 10 billion by 2050. We also know that the middle class is growing as a percentage of the population. Now remember, meat is an aspirational food. So as a result of that, the projections are that meat demand will nearly double by 2050. So what we will have on our hands at that time is a global protein shortage. We simply don't have the resources to provide protein to a population of 10 billion with a larger middle class. So in that sense, alternative proteins are not a nice to have. It is something that is absolutely necessary if we are to meet the food demand that will be there in 2050. So most of you know that alternative proteins are disrupting animal agriculture. Today, this is globally a $2.1 trillion US market, and every single number in this market is heading up and to the right. Alternative proteins today are just 1% of this market, so about $20 billion in size. But the projections are that in 10 years, that will go 10x to 200 billion. And in 2050, when the overall animal agriculture market is about $3.5 trillion in size, alternative proteins will take between a 30 to 60% market share and become essentially $1 to $2 trillion in size. So about 100x of where it is today. So I can tell you that as someone who started his first internet company in 1996, we believe that this is that 1995 moment for alternative proteins. And there is a massive, massive economic opportunity ahead. Now, as compelling as the economics might be, we are, as I mentioned, an impact fund. And we think the impact side is equally compelling. Today, animal agriculture is about 14.5% of global warming. That would make it more than the transportation sector, so more than all the trains, planes, cars combined. It is today also the #1 cause of deforestation, of large ocean dead zones that kill everything within them, and of species extinction. Altogether, the sector takes 1/3 of our land, 1/3 of our water, causes 3/4 of our disease, takes 80% of our antibiotics, and in the process, we end up killing 70 billion land animals and between 1 to 2 trillion fish every single year. So the promise of alternative proteins is, first of all, to bring down greenhouse gas emissions for the sector by 90%. But beyond that, to use 5x less energy, 10x less water, 100x less land, and kill no animals or fish in the process. Really, the main difference will be that the food that we get is going to be bacteria-free, contaminant-free, antibiotic-free. But everything else essentially will be the same. So we are seeing a very, very significant shift happening already. Today, 92 to 93% of the customers of Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods are meat eaters. Beyond Meat is today sold in 112,000 retail outlets. In the food service sector, McDonald's, Burger King, all the major food service operators are either using these brands to have plant-based offerings or they're creating their own offerings. You also see a similar shift happening in the grocery sector. You see it happening across the board when it comes to a shift toward plant-based alternatives. The meat producers have literally rebranded themselves to become protein companies. And all of the major food companies, from Nestle to Unilever, are either highly acquisitive in this space or are creating their own brands. So I want to give you a window into what's happening in dairy. So this is a graph that shows dairy alternative market share relative to the conventional dairy by segment. So you can see milk, cheese, ice cream, and so on. And at the top, you see the plant-based alternative market share. So the shift is clearly already starting to happen. But remember, over time, this is going to be 30 to 60% market share. So it's important to recognize how early it is. The 7.6% market share that you see in milk in the US, which is the most advanced market today, is 14% and growing very, very quickly. So when you go to the more advanced markets, you see the shift as being even more dramatic. So for our fund, what we do is to segment this space across 4 key vectors. The first is the customer, where we invest both in consumer brands as well as in the underlying supply chain. And the underlying supply chain today is rather anemic. When you look closely at Impossible Foods or Beyond Meat, you'll see that they're made using a relatively small set of core ingredients, which would be soy or peas, oats, pulses. What you don't see are a broader set of ingredients, indigenous ingredients, upstream formulations that can then be used to make the manufacturing process more efficient. We believe all of that will happen. In addition to investing in plant-based technology, which a lot of you are familiar with, basically using protein isolates with fats and other ingredients, we invest in cell-based, where you're growing animal cells outside the animal, or microorganism-based, which is bacteria or yeast or algae or mycelium or other microorganisms that are either grown as a biomass or they are secreting proteins or enzymes or nutrients that are then being used by food manufacturers. We invest across the range of products, that is food products, meat, seafood, dairy, and eggs. But we also invest in materials, principally leather, which you may have noticed on the earlier slide is about a $100 billion market, and also wool and silk, which come out of animals. And then we invest globally, as I mentioned, but North America today is the most advanced market, wonderful bleeding edge companies with traction. But Asia is over time going to be the largest market, but nascent in its development. So it's very nice to be able to see a more advanced market and how that's developing, and have a very young market where we can invest in and take advantage of the trends that unfold. Now, if we take those same vectors and we put them along the side, as I've done here, and we add stage, and then we go from less developed on the left side to more developed on the right side, what you basically get is a map of the space. And you can see for customer, for example, consumer brands, there's some very well-known ones, but the supply chain not as developed. Plant-based far along, cell-based just emerging. Meat and dairy getting more established, but seafood and materials relatively early. North America, a market that is further along, but Asia and rest of the world are a bit further behind. And so you see this dynamic going across this market, which is one of the reasons that we are actually a multi-stage fund. We invest in late stage and early stage because of this particular dynamic. The other thing that's really important to recognize are the challenges and risks that exist in this sector. You know, when you go to the early days of the internet, people forget that a lot of the technology infrastructure, the regulatory environment, whether consumers would use the internet in large numbers, those were unknown. There were actually a lot of debates about them. And something similar is going on in this sector. So there are clear technical hurdles for plant-based foods to achieve price parity. And this will not happen with scale. It will happen with innovation. Cell-based meat has bona fide technical challenges before it is a commercial offering that can be offered at a large scale. We also need to educate consumers that alternative proteins are in fact a viable alternative, that in many cases they're actually better for you. And even if we do convince them, the underlying scale-up infrastructure isn't there yet. A lot of the equipment and machinery that's there isn't what you need to make plant-based or cell-based meat. And so that will need to be redone, it will need to be innovated, and that's going to require a massive amount of effort and capital, which has yet to be put into the space. From a regulatory perspective, you have battles being fought all over the world, and they are being fought in areas like labeling and areas like safety. Singapore today, for example, is the only jurisdiction in the world that allows the sale of cell-based meat, which has only been given to one company for one product. But there are more philosophical debates as well on the regulatory side, and GMO is a very good example of that. So there is a company called Perfect Day, which has $360 million in funding. What Perfect Day does is that they genetically modify yeast and they have them secrete whey, which is the protein in milk. Now, while the yeast are genetically modified, the protein that comes out, the whey, is molecularly identical to the whey that comes out of a cow, or that is in milk. The US says, no problem, as long as that is identical, this is not GMO. Europe says nothing doing, that is absolutely GMO. And so these are the kinds of battles that are going to be fought over time. Now, we continue to believe that this sector will end up in a very good place and that these products will be well established, but these are each challenges that will require an enormous amount of effort, and it is far from certain that we will get there. We also, I think, at the same time recognize that perhaps what seems so revolutionary, like, for example, making meat outside the animal, may not be as revolutionary as we think when we put it into a historical perspective. And history has, over time, seen technology shift a lot of things and our mindset along with it. There was a time when ice used to be trucked down from the mountains. And so when refrigerators started making ice, people would call that artificial ice. Imagine doing something like that today, calling that artificial ice. We would kill whales in large numbers for whale oil, and then kerosene came along in the 1800s. We rode horses until we invented the car. Insulin used to come out of the intestinal linings of pigs and cows until synthetic insulin was invented about 40 years ago. Just ask yourself whether you would prefer to have animal or synthetic insulin today if you needed it. So the idea of animal meat being produced outside the animal as cultivated meat isn't actually so revolutionary when you consider the fact that this is simply just technology that is just being applied to a different sector than it was in the past.
Gautam, I think he has frozen. In any case, I guess these are the last three quotes. This is one of the three quotes. Basically, Pat Brown is the CEO of Impossible Foods. Basically, he says, unlike the cow, we get better at making meat every single day. So again, idea you have being that as the technology just keeps improving, they're not going to stop where it ends at meat, but they'll crank it up so that it tastes even better than meat. And of course, taking away all the bacterias and contaminants and antibiotics and things like that. So yeah, I guess that's the end of the presentation, and we'll just wait for Gautam to dial back in. But in the meantime, happy to answer questions.
So Jayesh, obviously that was super interesting, and congrats again on all the progress. One question I had, just to get the ball rolling. In particular, Gautam mentioned this optimistic view of the future where 30 to 60% of alternative protein would be plant-based. And I was just wondering, is that a conjecture or an assumption, or is there some sort of analysis, more critical analysis that goes behind that number?
Yeah, there are sufficient reports, and we can point those links to you and send you some of those reports. And there are two classes of reports, right? One which is very optimistic, and they think that 60% of it will be taken over, will be taken by the plant-based, cell-based alternative proteins. And so if you take 60% of 3 trillion, then that takes you to 2 trillion. However, there are a lot of conservative reports saying if you just at the least, if you do these things, and of course, as Gautam mentioned, it's not tenable. And so if you just take 30%, then it'll end up at 1 trillion. So it's anywhere between 30 to 60%, but there are reports basically on both sides. So we can point you to those reports. Gautam, welcome back.
Thanks. I just wanted to say that you don't have to agree with me, but just don't hang up on me if you don't like what I have. So it's just, you know, one of those things. So let me just, if you wouldn't mind, you'll indulge me. I'll just talk to you through the rest of it.
Sure.
There's just a couple of more quotes that I want to tell you. What I was talking about with the quote that I mentioned from the CEO of Impossible Foods is that when you have a situation where one product is set and the other industry is improving its products using technology, it is such a substantial shift. So when Impossible Burger 1.0 came out, and this is the point that I was getting to, it was a well-regarded product, but when Impossible Burger 2.0 came out, 50% of the people could not tell the difference between the Impossible Burger and actual meat. That's how much of a better product it was. So imagine you get to Impossible Burger 5.0, and now you have a product where the taste and nutrition profile, ingredient deck is far, far superior. Do you believe, for example, that it is possible to produce a meat product that tastes better than conventional meat, that is actually healthier for you? Because that is the kind of place where we are headed. Next quote from the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, said, "It's delicious and guilt-free, can't taste the difference." This was his quote when he was trying cultivated steak. This is made by an Israeli company, so it's steak made from animal cells outside the animal. The question is, why would he taste a difference? He's tasting a product that is molecularly identical to meat. The only difference is that it is bacteria-free, contaminant-free, and antibiotic-free. Otherwise, there's no difference at all in the product. And finally, Sir Richard Branson, founder of Virgin Group, in 30 years, it is unlikely animals will need to be killed for food anymore. So this is the kind of statement that you see on paper and you say, wow, that doesn't really seem believable. Except that if you think about a time 30 years ago, so go back 30 years ago, go back to 1991. No commercial internet, no email. There is no Google, no Facebook, no Amazon, no cloud. Try explaining to someone where we would be today. And it is an extremely foreign concept at that time. And so I think we forget what kind of change happens in a period of 30 years. And I think that's where we are headed. So I will stop there. Jayesh, I think you were making some comments, but perhaps you can jump in again.
No, I think Professor Jasjit was just asking that,
Yeah.
you know, you mentioned in the beginning that 30 to 60% will be the market share by 2050. And so he wondered where the data was coming from. You can stop sharing the screen now.
Yeah, let me just a moment, and I will first stop screen sharing. Yeah, so that is actually a series of studies that have been done and pretty well documented in reports now. The specific sources are a couple of reports. There's an organization called Rethink, Jeffries, the World Economic Forum, and the UN. So those are the primary sources.
Sure, thank you. Let me open it up for the students, and if anybody is interested in any questions, let them ask first. About Joseph, go ahead.
So one thing that I've read about is the like growing cells in a petri dish is great, but you don't get the structure of the meat, whether that's sort of a steak with the fat lined in with the rest of the meat to really get the texture and the flavor right. And I think that that's like a technological issue. And I wonder if you guys have either seen companies or invested in companies that are solving not just the growth and the sort of cultivation of the cells, but also the sort of architecture.
Yes, it's an excellent point. So if you notice, a lot of the products that are initially being created, they're actually ground meat products. where the structuring is far, far easier to do. To give you some background, the way that cultured or cell-based or cultivated meat is created is that you start with some cell lines and you feed them growth media. So we're talking about glucose and fats, water. Then there is some scaffolding put around them. So the scaffolding is specifically what you're referring to. This on a steak is what gives you the line for the fat and the marbling of the muscle. And then that's put into a bioreactor to grow it. Most of the cost actually is in the cell media, but what you're referring to is the scaffolding side. And to be specific, we actually are invested in a company working specifically on that. It's a company called Novel Farms. It's 2 PhDs out of Berkeley, and whole muscle proteins are 90% of the in this case, the beef market. They're going after beef first. And what they're doing is basically creating 3D bioscaffolding structures so that you can grow cells around them. And depending on whether you grow fat or muscle cells on certain parts of that scaffolding, you will end up with what looks like a steak.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah.
Andy?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I mean, what gets a lot of media coverage is kind of the insect-based protein as kind of alternative protein, but as I seen in your presentation, it's definitely excluded. So I would be interested where you see that kind of in your vision.
Yeah, absolutely. Very watchful eye there. It's something that we sometimes talk about, though not always. So we as a fund don't invest in insect proteins. Insect proteins very much by a lot of folks are considered an alternative protein. So depending on the definition of alternative proteins, it includes insect proteins. The reason we don't invest in it is not because it's not a good business. Actually, insect protein has found a really good market in things like animal feed, though it is a little ways away from large-scale consumer adoption because of a bit of that yuck factor. But there's some hard work going on to do that. Our reason to not invest in it is that we envision a world where animal agriculture is replaced by what we see to be the most sustainable technologies, which are plant-based, cell-based, recombinant. We don't envision a world where animal farms are replaced by insect farms. And it is just our view of where we want to see the world go.
Thank
Good
you.
enough. Ginny?
Thanks so much for your presentation. You started with kind of the 3 trends that you see going in this direction, and one of them was kind of the middle class or the idea that these alt proteins are going to become very attractive and affordable to a middle class consumer. And the way I see them right now, even when I buy a Beyond sandwich at a Dunkin' Donuts or a Burger King, still like the price is considerably higher. And so I'm curious to hear your perspective on when you think the middle class consumer will actually be able to access some of these products, whether from a cost perspective or from a even just perception perspective of these alt meat proteins being like a normal thing to eat.
Yeah, it's a great question. And obviously we don't have firm answers to these. I would have thought that with plant-based technologies, we will see price parity in the latter part of this decade. And that's a function of the fact that we'll see a broader set of ingredients and better upstream formulations. With cell-based meat, I don't believe that we will see that until the 2030s. And in fact, when you look at the projections of when animal agriculture begins to go down, a lot of the conventional wisdom says that cell-based meat and access to cell-based meat at reasonable prices is critical for that. So there's a term that you may have heard of called peak meat. And that is when the combination of plant-based and cell-based meats actually start to turn the trend of animal agriculture, which is projected to be in the 2030s.
Thank you. Emily?
Hi. Okay, sorry about that. So question is on the line of
You can also send us your question on chat if that's easier.
I think we're probably good now. So sorry about that. My question is following on from Ginny's, and it is around. Are we okay?
Emily, why don't you put it in the chat, and then in the meantime, you can go ahead with your question. Then we can't hear you. I think you didn't connect. Must be a France thing.
How about now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. Like, really fascinating presentation. And I think, like, as a flexitarian myself, like, it's such an interesting topic that, you know, I'm always been. I was living in DC last year, with like the Beyond Burgers finally showing up in the retail outlet. You know, I'm kind of like the first one, the adopter, right? Because I'm too lazy and I'm not strong enough to actually give up meat. But you know, alternative proteins that taste exactly like it is kind of the way for me to reduce animal content in my diet. So really fascinating. But my question is kind of around how I think an interesting aspect of this disruption that you guys are really fueling is that it's up against, as you mentioned, this like really powerful industry. And the powerful industry is also fueled by something that is a very personal decision and kind of a philosophical thing that a lot of people hold, which is that like eating meat is healthy, and that, you know, you need to have meat as part of your diet or else, you know, you're going to be living unhealthily. And this is interesting that like in different countries, I think it's very different as well. Like I'm from Japan, also from the States, very different mentalities towards meat consumption. And I read articles about how sometimes the conversation around alternative proteins can lead to somewhat of a, you know, an antagonistic reaction among people who've never really thought about reducing the meat content in their diet, because it kind of makes them feel guilty about it for the first time. And it's kind of this like vegan, vegetarian versus meat eater kind of tension that you might have conversation around dinner table that gets a little bit heated. So my question to you is, as an investor working in this space, have you encountered kind of this type of pushback from these philosophical differences, either with other investors or business partners? And how do you manage that? And I'm guessing it's by focusing on the data and focusing on the economic opportunity, but I would love to hear a little bit more from you guys about how you kind of see that playing out in part of this disruption and how you manage it.
Yeah, it's a really important dynamic. If I may take some liberties with your question, I don't care much what other investors think about it. I care what consumers think about it, and consumers do believe that many of them that meat is healthy, and I think that there's a range of studies out there, and there's a lot of confusion out there. So I'm not here to talk about whether meat is healthy or not healthy. Is the first thing that I would say. The second thing I would say is I think it's an extraordinarily unreasonable ask to ask someone to give up the food that they grew up eating. None of us want to do that. No one wants to not eat the food that we grew up eating, right? That's not reasonable. And to tell someone further that, let's say you say it's bad for the environment or it's having these other adverse effects. Well, so is single-use plastic. So is flying on airplanes. So are a lot of other things. And so the fact that someone chooses to fly on an airplane and use single-use plastics but not eat meat is not better off than someone who eats meat but say flies, doesn't fly on an airplane. And so we can't get into these kinds of philosophical debates. I think that if we see that there are things that we are doing, whether it's single-use plastics or flying on airplanes or eating meat, that is hurting our planet. It is hurting other beings on the planet. And at least in certain aspects, it is hurting our health. And we won't go broader, but I'm talking about things like saturated fat and cholesterol that are less debatable. I think we need to use what is at our disposal. We need to use technology to give people alternatives. We need to give folks alternatives. No one is setting out to harm animals or to harm the planet. This is not something anyone's doing on purpose. We just don't believe we have a choice because of what's in front of us. And we are far more a product, I won't get too philosophical here, but we're just far more a product of our conditioning than we like to admit. And I think that this is about offering alternatives that are better for us and better for the planet. So I'm excited about generating those alternatives. I'm excited about getting consumers more choice and getting our planet healthier. And I'm less concerned about passing judgment on this or that, because I'm living a highly imperfect lifestyle on my own. I've got single-use plastics in my life. I don't think we can look at things that way.
Jen, just to give you another small perspective on the other side, we've had a couple of investors who are from a religion which is called Jain. And Jains, of course, don't eat meat, but they don't also try not to hurt insects and animals. We had a couple of Jains who actually declined from investing in the fund because we will also invest in cell-based. I mean, so we're not going to give up on cell ag. I mean, cell ag is the ultimate answer, right? After 10 years, 15 years, 20 years to take animals out of the food chain and yet have the taste and the texture and the price of an animal or a meat content, right? So we do face on two extremes, people who are eating meat and saying, hey, listen, I'm not going to give it up. And on the other side, people are saying, listen, what you guys are doing is still sort of producing meat, though it's in the lab.
All right, I know Emily now is on Minlims. Go ahead, you can use that.
Okay, sorry again for the audio issue.
No worries.
My question is around as consumers, as there's a move towards more local consumption and kind of eating more whole foods and less processed foods, what does the role of these plant-based or even cell cultured meats play, which requires such a significant technological intervention and most likely kind of transport from a faraway place. And kind of related to that, it seems also that it is moving away from a notion of like food sovereignty and kind of having the means for populations to feed themselves, which some countries in some areas are moving towards, and kind of concentrating the production in the hands of some smaller groups of people and companies in more developed parts of the world.
Is Gautam still there? So Jayesh, maybe you can take it. So the question was, this seems to be going against the spirit of a decentralized economy where every country has control over being able to feed their population. Instead, it goes in the hands of 10, 20, 30 big global companies who are doing all this fancy technology stuff.
Yeah. So I guess, you know what, in a way, it is no different from the other products like FMCG products and things like that. Most of this will actually become decentralized because food won't be exported like just from one country, like say China or America. There will be decentralized many plants. So for example, right now, Eat Just is setting up a plant here in Singapore for distribution in Southeast Asia. Once it expands, it will set up plants in China and India. So yeah, there might be an owner of the IP, but it'll be distributed in terms of the plants all over the world. I mean, this is no different from just about any companies today, including, let's say, Cargill or Tesco or any of those.
All right, so last two questions, Belinda and then Barkha, and then I think we're out of time.
Yeah, thanks very much for your presentation and for your time being here today. Fascinating topic. Personally, having been strictly vegan for 4 years now, I'm very interested to a world where everyone won't think I'm quite so crazy as I am today, if nothing else. And following on from your responses to Jen's question in particular, the presentation and answers to some other questions talked about the trends and this 30 to 60% number. I personally believe that, or at least I hope we'll reach that place. However, I haven't really heard what will be the key drivers for this shift. Like traditionally, people making these choices, it's been because of three main reasons: health, environment, or animal rights. But I wonder if there will be the same reasons moving forward, if other things are more coming into play, and between some of the things you've mentioned, what you see as being the biggest drivers.
So,
hi, Jay. Go ahead. Welcome back.
Yeah, my apologies. I really appreciate where you're coming from. I ate a strict vegan diet for 3 years, and when I got to Singapore 4 months ago, I broadened a little bit. I'm probably still 95% vegan and vegetarian. there is a saying in this industry that taste is king and price is queen. And in 30 years, I don't know what the food system exactly is going to look like, but I feel very confident that taste will still be king and price will still be queen. And so I think that we are not yet at taste or price parity. So all of this market share shift that you are seeing is because of some consumers that are saying this is more healthy, or I care about the planet, and that is not going to get us to mainstream consumers. What will get us to mainstream consumers is when the taste profiles are the same or better, and when the price is the same or lower. And I believe that we will achieve both. When you go to the doctor and the doctor says, I see that you're eating meat and this has high cholesterol, why don't you eat the version with no cholesterol that's identical, right? Those are the kinds of things. Or when you go and you see two pieces of meat side by side and one is bacteria-free, antibiotic-free, and contaminant-free, or one actually tastes significantly better than the other, which is where I actually believe we will arrive with cultivated meat. That's when consumers are going to shift. It'll just take a couple of decades to do that.
Thanks very much. Super interesting.
It can be king or queen, so just making sure that it doesn't have to be a king. But the other small thing is that the economics will also drive it, right? I mean, look at technology. There was a jet stream, and then as the jet stream just expanded and sped, more and more people got into it. And I think all protein, our view, the reason we are doing this now today is where internet was in the mid-90s. And I think the economic jet stream will be so strong in this that more and more people will join in. And then, of course, the taste and the price will, of course, have parity then.
Barkha, your last real short question and short answer, please. We are a bit behind time.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you for the presentation, Gautam and Jayesh. I have actually a very small and rather clarifying question. So in your presentation, you mentioned that there would be almost 90% less greenhouse gas emissions and water consumption because of the artificial meat or the synthetic meat products. So my question is, how are you estimating the emissions reduction? And is it just like the scope 1 emission reduction, or you're talking about the entire scope 1, 2, or 3? And if at all, do you foresee any sort of negative environmental consequences because of artificial synthesis or chemical synthesis of meat?
It's a great question. I think the short answer is these, because the manufacturing processes are so early and the technologies are so early, it's hard to tell about those things. With greenhouse gas emissions, it's some of the same studies that I quoted, but the numbers become radically different because most of that cost is coming from the feed and actually the life of the animal, which doesn't happen anymore. So that's fundamentally why. It's 25 calories into 1 calorie out for beef. With alternative proteins, it's closer to 3 to 1. However, it is true that the numbers for cultivated meat for energy, for example, are significantly higher than for plant-based. And for energy use, actually, it's not that different. So there's things like that that are different. It actually does use more water as well. So, so there are dynamics like that at play when you go deeper into the industry. So for example, if cultivated meat wins, then it's a different profile than if plant-based meat wins.
Thank you so much. So we have to leave it at that. Maybe just 30 seconds each, just for a strong finish. For anybody who wants to break into a sector like this from the company side or from the just getting a job at a fund like yours, what would you advise? What should they be focusing on right now among the student crowd to ultimately make it into a career path which sort of ties into some of these issues and they get to play a role?
Again, I'll just continue with that jet stream. I think this is a powerful jet stream. What we're doing is an intersection of economics, technology, and mission, right? So if this mission, this purpose really is something that you're passionate about and you feel you want to work in a social enterprise, social impact fund setup, then this is an excellent new sector to join and come in.
And I should add there, by the way, I think it's already posted in the handouts for today. Jayesh and Gautam are actually hiring. So for an intern, I think. So their job posting is up on the course platform for today. So this was partly a recruiting talk, actually.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for having us today. Really nice to be with all of you. Have a great day.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Really enjoyed it.
Okay.
Jayesh and Gautam, until next time. Bye.